In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the flywheel on an Echo trimmer. The flywheel performs several functions for your trimmer's engine. First, it contains the magnets that, along with the ignition coil, create the electricity for the engine's spark plug. The spacing of the magnets, along with the diameter of the flywheel, determine the timing of that spark. The flywheel has the cooling fins to cool the engine, and the overall mass of the flywheel keeps up the engine's momentum as it goes through its combustion cycle. Typical reasons to replace the flywheel would be a sheared key where the flywheel mounts to the crankshaft, or damage to the cooling fins. Flywheels are easy to replace, and we're going to show you how. Flywheels, as well as many other parts, can be found on our website. Let's get started. I'll begin by removing the air filter cover and the air filter. Before we remove any of the fuel lines from either the carburetor or the fuel tank, you'll want to make sure that you've drained the gas from the fuel tank. Otherwise it will leak, as the fuel in the tank tends to be slightly pressurized. I've already drained the fuel, so we can go ahead and move on. Next, I'll remove the air filter bracket as well as the air filter base. They're secured with 2 screws. There's the air filter base and the air filter bracket. Now I'll remove the throttle cable and the fuel lines from the carburetor. Pull that away from the carburetor, as well as the throttle cable. And on the underside, I'll remove the fuel lines. Between the carburetor and the isolator block is the intake gasket, and that'll usually just fall away, or you may have to pull it or scrape it away from the isolator block or the carburetor. Now I'll go ahead and remove the isolator block. Now I'll remove the spark plug boot and the spark plug. Now I'll remove the motor housing. It's held in place with 2 screws. Now I can remove the insulator gasket. Now I'll remove the starter. There's 4 screws on the back, 1 on the side, and 1 between the fuel tank and the starter. Now I'll remove the fuel tank. It's secured with 2 screws. Now I'll remove the air duct. There's just 1 more screw securing it. Now I'll separate the clutch and shaft assembly from the engine. First I'll go ahead and disconnect the ignition wires. They just pull apart. And now remove the 4 screws that secure the clutch housing to the engine. I'll just give the motor a couple of taps with a mallet and it'll slide apart. Now I'll remove the clutch, but I can't just simply thread it off of the spindle because as I turn the clutch, the motor will just spin. So I need to bind up the motor. To do that, I'll put a piece of starter rope into the cylinder through the spark plug hole. The rope will take up the space between the piston and the top of the cylinder and bind the engine. And now I can unthread the clutch. Now we have access to the flywheel. To remove it, I'll pull out on the flywheel and at the same time tap on the motor spindle with a rubber mallet. It's important to use a rubber mallet here because a metal hammer will damage the end of the spindle. Now install our new flywheel. You'll notice that the end of the crankshaft is tapered, and that lines up with a taper on the flywheel. Also, there's a key on the flywheel, and that lines up with the keyway on the crankshaft. The cooling fins go against the engine. Once I have it aligned, I'll give it a couple of taps with the rubber shop mallet. We'll tighten up the rest of the way with the clutch. Now reinstall and secure the clutch. Now remove the starter rope from the cylinder. Whenever you remove either the flywheel or the ignition coil, you'll need to reset the air gap between the magnets on the flywheel and the contacts on the ignition coil. To do that, I'll use an ignition coil gapping tool. All this is a piece of plastic that's 14 thousandths of an inch thick. If you don't have one of these tools, you can usually just use a good heavy business card, as that'll be very close to the same thickness. To set the gap, I'll loosen the two screws on the ignition coil. That allows me to move the coil. Now rotate the flywheel until the magnets line up with the contacts on the ignition coil. Insert the gauge and allow the magnets to pull the coil tight against the flywheel. Now I just tighten up the screws. And remove the gauge. Now I can reinstall the engine assembly back onto the shaft and clutch assembly. There's some alignment pins to line everything up, and then I'll secure it with the screws. Now I'll reconnect the ignition wires. And I'll tuck the wires away in the holder on the side of the engine. Now I'll reinstall the fuel tank. Now I'll reinstall the air duct. Now I'll install the starter. Line the starter up. Sometimes you have to give the rope a little pull to get the starter pawls to engage, and then secure it with the screws. Now install the insulator gasket. I'll place it up against the motor block and now work the cover over the top of the engine. The gasket needs to go behind the cover. I also want to make sure I have the ignition wire inside of the cover. Once everything's aligned, I'll secure the cover with the screws. Now I'll reinstall the spark plug and the spark plug boot. Now we'll install the carburetor insulator. These nuts go on the back side of the insulator, and those are for the screws that secure the carburetor. You'll notice there's an opening at the bottom of the insulator, and that needs to line up with this opening on the bottom of the intake port. I'll thread the screws through the insulator first, and that way I can line them up with the holes in the insulator gasket. Now we'll reinstall the fuel lines and the throttle cable to the carburetor. To install the fuel lines, first I need to figure out which one is the incoming line. To do that, I just open the gas tank, look inside, and find the line that has the fuel filter attached. In this case, it's the black one. The yellow one will be the return line. Now on the carburetor, I want to find the incoming side. To do that, I'll place my finger over each of the fuel line connections while priming. One of them won't let any air out, and the other will tend to suck against my finger, and that's the incoming line. So I'll attach the incoming line to the black or incoming fuel line, and the return line, in this case, to the yellow fuel line. Now I'll reinstall the throttle cable. First, I'll open up the throttle and thread the cable into the connection on the top of the carburetor. Next, I'll place the nut in its holder on the carburetor and tighten up the secondary nut with a wrench. Now I'll reinstall the air filter bracket, air filter base, carburetor, and the intake gasket. I'll thread the two screws that hold this whole assembly through the air filter base. Next, they thread through the carburetor, and then through the intake gasket. And again, I want to line up the holes on the gasket with the hole on the insulator block. And now I'll install the air filter and the air filter cover.